I'm Taylor.
And I'm Tyler.
This is Scripture Central's Come Follow Me Insights. This week, part 2 of the episode covering Matthew 21 through 23, Mark 11, Luke 19 through 20, and John 12.
So in episode 1, we covered most of the stories that are in Mark, Luke, and John, and the Matthew 21 and the first half of chapter 22. So today, in this second episode, we're going to cover the second half of Matthew 22 and all of Matthew 23. So to begin, there are 3 experiences here, starting in verse 15, where Jesus is going to be judged, tempted, tried by 3 different groups of people. So in your scriptures, if you were to mark them, you would say, verse 15, this is where the Pharisees come to prove him, to tempt him. Verse 23 is where the Sadducees take their shot at tempting him and pushing him into a corner to trap him. And then verse 35 is where a lawyer or a scribe comes to do his testing of Jesus. So there's some incredible significance in having Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes sending representatives in turn right here a few days before Jesus' crucifixion to tempt him, to examine him, and to try to trap him.
So we have in the Passover season, over the years as the Jews would celebrate, they would have a lamb that they would use for Passover service, that they would slaughter and consume. But before that, before you would slaughter that lamb, you would have to bring that lamb to the temple to be examined by the authorities to ensure that that lamb was ready for the sacrifice. And it seems that Matthew is making it very clear for us that Jesus is the lamb being brought to the temple, being examined by the authorities. And actually, he's found worthy by God, even though the authorities don't seem to get the message.
So let's jump into the Pharisees' trap first, starting in verse 15. Now keep in mind, this is a group who they know that they're going to get their shot at trapping Jesus. So you can picture these backroom conversations. What could we do with him in front of the big group in the temple that would make him just look terrible and would ultimately be his demise? So they've crafted their best case trap for him, and now they spring it, or rather they try to spring it on him. It comes in verse 15. Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Master, we know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. Can you hear the flattery and the false praise that they're laying on him to try to soften him up so that he would walk into their trap? Now, while those techniques might work with normal people, they don't work great with the Son of God. And so here's their trap. You ready for this? Tell us, therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? So after their flattery, you speak the truth. You're such a wise master, and we're really wrestling with this debate of, is it really okay for us to continue to pay tribute to Rome? Because we know what happens when we pay money to Caesar. It gets spent to build pagan temples, pagan idols, and to build up that Roman Empire, which is rooted in idol worship.
And you're also using money to pay the army that's oppressing us. So there's a lot of reasons they don't like paying the tax.
So can you see the trap? Two-sided here. If he says, don't pay it, well, you now have an insurrectionist claim on their hands to say, see? And if he says, do pay it, then they say, well, then you're not supporting the law of Moses, that you're not supposed to worship idols. You're not supposed to support oppressors. So they're thinking, this is the perfect trap. We've got him. Can you picture that moment, that pause after they've laid the question at his feet and all the people are sitting there thinking, what's he going to say? And
I love what he says. Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why tempt ye me, ye actors, you hypocrites? So the word is actor. Like, they're not sincere. He's like, let's have a real conversation about real issues that people really care about. Instead, you guys are just acting with the intention of creating problems for me and actually for a lot of other people.
So then he says, verse 19, show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. So I have here a replica denarius that was made out of silver from my friend Richard Beach, a jeweler. And this is an exact replica of what coins, these pennies, or a penny in that day would look like. And so he says, show it to me. So they produce one and show it to him. Now look at the next thing he says. And he saith unto them, whose is this image and superscription? And they say unto him, well, it's got Caesar's image on the coin, as you can see here. And his answer is, okay, well, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Now, most people read that verse and think, wow, that was ingenious. He got out of their trap. He didn't take a side. He just said, look, if it's got Caesar's image on it, then render it to Caesar, because it's his. And then we often stop there and smile at how smart Jesus was to overcome this trap. And perhaps we might miss, from my opinion, from my perspective, the single most important part of the entire interchange here, which is a message not just to overcome the trap for this group of Pharisees and Herodians that came to him, but for disciples of Christ in that temple setting, as well as in the 21st century today reading this story. It's that second phrase. It's far less focused on render unto Caesar that the things which are Caesar's, and it's the second phrase, and render unto God the things which are God's. You'll notice, how do I know that this coin is Caesar's? Because it has Caesar's image on it. So how do I know what to render to God? Well, probably something that has God's image on it. And there's only one thing that has God's image on it, and that's God's children. That's you. That's me. So at the end of the day here, when Jesus makes this statement, the message to me as a disciple of Christ is, Tyler, you need to give your life, render to God, you. You'll notice how much easier it is to pay money and to give things away as opposed to giving yourself. So full consecration is to render unto God my whole life. It's to say to the Lord, you can have anything that you want. It's all yours. I place my whole life into your hands. To render unto God the things which are God's is a very profound teaching for complete consecration to the Lord.
This is really transformative. If we go back into Genesis and we hear about creation, and the crowning event is God creating us, his children, in his image. And those in the crowd who, with ears to hear, should have seen that that is true. I am in the image of God, and I need to give myself to him. And it's also significant that in the ancient Middle East, most of the surrounding cultures would create images of their gods and spend a lot of time taking care of those statues and dressing them up and giving them food and building temples or houses to those images. And think about the revolutionary concept that God teaches in scriptures. Instead of you creating images that you spend time focusing on, I've created an image that I want you to focus on. That image is me, and it's in you, and it's in everybody around you.
So we've overcome the test or the trial from the Pharisees that had started in verse 15. Now we go to the second trial laid at his feet, the second trap or examination from the Sadducees, which, remember, they don't believe in the resurrection. It tells you that in verse 23. The same day came to him the Sadducees, which say there is no resurrection. It's really simple to remember the difference between Pharisees and Sadducees in their doctrine. Sadducees don't believe in resurrection, and that's sad-you-see. It's just a simple way to keep that straight. The Sadducees is the group, they're more of the aristocracy of the Jews. They're more of the rich, the elite, the highborn. And as such, they have many more opportunities for political appointments from the Romans, and previous to the Romans, the Greeks, back before Pompey overthrew the Greek control. So they have become more, shall we say, attached to the doctrines and the philosophies of the world of their day, and the Greek philosophies that come down from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, 400 years before Christ. All of those doctrines and those teachings have pretty much infiltrated the ranks of the Sadducees. The Greeks don't believe in the resurrection. The Greeks don't believe in angels. The Greeks don't believe all of these things that are in the Old Testament. And so it doesn't come as a shock that the Sadducees are going to have adopted many of those philosophies and find ways to say, we're still good practicing Jews, even though we don't believe all of these things that the Pharisees have been teaching.
Yeah. So what their focus is on, they're focusing on death. They're trying to trap Jesus in this discussion about what happens at death or after death. And we'll just give you the preview. Jesus focuses on life. So it's very interesting how he turns the tables and says, you're asking the wrong questions. You're so worried about what happens in death or after death. Why not focus on what happens in life? And he himself is the bringer of life.
This is the scenario that they're using as a trap against Jesus. You ready? Verse 24. Here's this group of Sadducees, and they say, Master, Moses said, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. That's called the levirate law of marriage. That if your older brother dies without seed, the younger brother, and it doesn't matter how much of an age separation there is, it just doesn't matter. When you're of age, you're under obligation to marry your brother's wife and raise up seed.
And the economic system in the very far ancient Israelite past was that the children were supposed to inherit what the parents had and also use those resources to support the parents in their old age, and also to maintain the name of that owner of the land on the land. And so this is all about land and inheritance and posterity and prosperity. So this tradition or this culture had been preserved for a lot of years.
So the story continues. This trap is being set here. Now there were with us, that's a really important distinction. There were with us, so these are Sadducees, 7 brethren, and the first, when he had married a wife, deceased, and having no issue, left his wife unto his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third unto the 7th. By the way, can you picture being the 7th brother thinking, you know, my 6 older brothers have all not lasted long in this marriage. I wonder how it's going to fare for me. So verse 27 says, and last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, remember, the Sadducees don't believe in resurrection. So it's one side of their trap. In the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the 7? For they all had her. Now watch carefully. Did you see the trap? In the resurrection, who's going to be married to this woman? Because all 7 had her. There's the trap. Now, this next verse, Jesus answered and said unto them, Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. That verse, that one verse, gets used all the time to say, see, there's no such thing as marriage. There's no such thing as eternal family. Here's the fascinating thing. The Sadducees had plenty of opportunity in their shady back rooms to come up with a trap for Jesus. Do any of you find it odd that they would use that example of pitting the doctrine of resurrection against the doctrine of marriage for eternity to say, we'll come up with a scenario where marriage for eternity in the resurrection doesn't work, and those are the two halves of their trap? If Jesus has never taught the eternal nature of marriage, why would they come up with a plan to trap him on something he's never taught? The idea being that Jesus has openly taught about resurrection and he's openly taught about eternal marriage, so they've come up with this scenario to try to disprove him and make him look bad. And some would say, well, no, he doesn't ever directly talk about eternal marriage. Well, there are other places where he's touched on this. He said things like, what God hath joined together, let no man divide asunder, when he was having that debate with Pharisees about divorce. There are enough hints that even though certain plain and precious truths might have been taken out of the Bible at one point, doesn't mean that Jesus couldn't have taught about these things, and there are enough hints in other places that he is talking about the eternal nature of family. And this, ironically, is, for me, one of the greatest sources to show that Jesus did teach eternal marriage, because of what the Sadducees are using that doctrine as a half of their trap in this instance. And here's the fascinating thing. If you write a cross-reference in your scriptures next to verse 30, write Doctrine and Covenants section 132, 15 through 17. In that passage, the Lord in section 132 is giving a series of different types of marriages that are performed and what effect they have. And the type of marriage in verse 15 through 17 is a marriage that is for time only. It's not performed with sealing keys under proper authority. It's just performed basically till death do you part. And if you look in Doctrine and Covenants 132, 15 through 17, you're going to see some identical wording to this exact passage here that gets repeated there in context of they will not be married because they weren't sealed. And remember back in the beginning in verse 25, now there were with us 7 brethren. So those marriages were performed under what authority? Under Sadducean authority. And they don't have the sealing keys. They are not sealing this woman to these 7 brothers. They're simply marrying her till death do they part. And those deaths came pretty quickly. And they parted pretty quickly. And so Jesus in verse 30 is saying, for in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. Perfect description from over there in section 132 of what happens to people who choose not to enter into a temple sealing that is for time and all eternity.
Really fascinating how this trap or this exchange ends. He uses these powerful phrases, 31 and 32. But as touching the resurrection of the dead, have you not read that which was spoken unto you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And pause right there. That phrase is the summary phrase pointing us back to the Abrahamic covenant. So I find this extremely powerful, that what is supposed to be a trap ends up being this lesson about covenants all of us have eternal access to if we choose to be loyal to God by keeping the commandments, which is a way of showing loyalty, which is interesting because what's the very next challenge?
It comes from the lawyer, the scribe, a temptation.
About which commandments
is the most
we
important.
should keep. How should we show our loyalty to God? So all these things are intertwined with the Old Testament, those two covenantal mountains. Mount Moriah, the eternal covenant that God gave to Abraham and all his descendants, and you are included in that as his descendant. And then Mount Sinai, where God, through Moses, gave a list of instructions for how people should be covenantally loyal to him. These are all bound up right here in these two little stories.
So look at the conclusion here of this Sadducean trap that Jesus unsprung and overcame. Verse 33, when the multitude heard this, they were astonished at his doctrine. They're sitting there saying, wow, this is deep. And so the Sadducee group walks away saying, we tried. We gave our very best thought to how we could trap him, and it didn't work. And so now, verse 34, but when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him and saying. So now you get this expert in the law of Moses, this scribe who knows the Old Testament very well. Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Can you see what he's trying to do? He's baiting Jesus to get into a debate here to show how much smarter he is than Jesus when it comes to knowing the law. He's going to let Jesus pick a commandment that he thinks is really important, and then he's going to Bible bash with him and show him lots of verses that would show that other commandments might be more important. So you're thinking, wow, how do you get out of that one? Well, watch what Jesus does. Jesus said unto him, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Two commandments.
This is really fascinating because how many commandments are there in the law of Moses?
613, and then if you were to boil those 613 specific parts of the law down to its simplest form, you would say, well, there are 10 commandments.
Which we get at Mount Sinai. And Jesus is giving us two. Now notice he says this phrase, upon these two laws hang all the law and the prophets. The law is the law of Moses, or the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. Love God, love your neighbor, and if you do those things, you are loyally entwined with God, and you receive all the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
You know, Taylor, I wonder if there is great application to us today in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think the same thing could be said. All of the procedures that happen in church, all of the programs, all of the policies, all of the practices, all of the commandments, all of the ordinances, everything that happens in the church could be hung on those two same commandments, those two same ideas of love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, might, mind, and strength, and love thy neighbor as thyself. Everything that we do in the church today, all of our efforts are built on those two things. It's pretty powerful when we keep things in that perspective. Otherwise, it's too easy to get off in the weeds of one of those 613 laws of Moses and think it's the most important aspect when God's the most important, and loving him and loving the neighbor. These should all be means to that end. And isn't it beautiful how you can take those 10 commandments, for instance, even if we boil from the 613 down to the 10, you look at those first 4, those are all focused on how you treat your relationship with God. No other gods before me, don't worship idols, don't take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, and remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. All of those are focused on your connection with God. And number 5 through 10 are all focused on how you treat people. Honor thy father and thy mother, don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie or bear false witness, and don't covet. Everything really does boil down into these two parts. And then later on, we're going to find that if you're in the service of your fellow men, in chapter 25 of Matthew, you're only in the service of your God. So even if I'm keeping the second commandment, that's an extension of how I keep the first commandment, how I love God. But we live in a world that wants to kind of reverse that order. Have you noticed that? A world that wants to emphasize loving your neighbor first. And then, if you've got any extra time or energy, then you can love God. There have been some beautiful conference talks given in the last few years about the importance of keeping that first commandment first. Love the Lord thy God first, and thy neighbor as thyself second. So you can see here that he's overcome the trap from the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and now the Pharisaical lawyer. And instead of just sitting there, now Jesus puts a little bit of focus on them. Look at verse 41. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them. Now he comes to them and says, "What think ye of Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One?" All of your messianic expectations that you're looking for. What do you think of him? Whose son is he? And they say unto him, "Well, he's the son of David." That's the prophecy, right?
Yeah, it's an appropriate title, but it gets a little more involved than that.
So then he says, so if the Messiah, the Christ, is going to be the son of David, then why did David in spirit call him Lord, saying, "The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou on my right hand till I make thine enemies thy footstool"? If David then call him Lord, how is he his son? And no man was able to answer him a word, neither durst any man from that day forth ask him any more questions. They've learned their lesson. You don't try to debate with Jesus because it's impossible. He always gets out of your trap that you lay for him, and you can't get out of the questions he asks you. There's no answer. And it's this beautiful realization that they finally come to of, okay, we're not gonna ask him any more questions. Which now brings us to chapter 23. This is a very direct chapter where he's condemning the Pharisees and the scribes, and he's speaking to the multitude and to his disciples. So
I find this interesting because it's almost like he is done having all these debates, and then he turns to his disciples and now says something about the individuals who were trying to trap him. And it doesn't make it absolutely clear here, but my assumption is that Matthew's trying to narrate that Jesus is describing for his people, here are the leaders of society that you should not be trying to spend any time with, unless you're just loving them and encouraging them to follow me.
So let's pick it up in verse 2. Jesus says to this multitude and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat." So this is the judgment, the instruction, the seat of leadership over the people. "All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not." So he's saying, look, they're teaching you out of the law. Observe the things that they're telling you to do, but don't watch their example and do what they're doing. "For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." So they're putting these expectations and these commandments upon you, but they're not willing to do it.
Listen to some of these words in the Greek, the burdens, heavy, hard to bear. A burden, for example, is something like you would put on the freight of a ship. So an individual ship just has to carry this, and it's like driven about. The heavy is something that's very burdensome or weighty, even oppressively or violently so. Or hard to bear, also the word comes from being oppressive. And the core word is just the enormous difficulty. Let's think again. Let's go back to Mount Sinai. Did God reveal the law of Moses for the intention to oppress people and make life difficult? Now, let's put context. The people had been oppressed and had very difficult taskmasters and burdens in Egypt. Life had been really difficult, and God liberated the people, brought them to Mount Sinai. Was his intention to be their taskmaster now? No, to be in relationship with them. So listen to this subtle thing that Jesus is saying. These Pharisees and scribes, they sit in Moses' seat. They teach the truth of how to be liberated through the gospel and through covenantal relationship. But what are they doing? They're acting like the Egyptian taskmasters to you. And God doesn't like that. God does not like people to be oppressed. That is one of the core essences of the gospel. So you get these subtle connections to the Old Testament and God's salvific efforts. Remember, this is Passover week. So this should be on people's minds that this is the time we celebrate God liberating us from oppressors and burdens and toil that keeps us from being in relationship with God.
So now he picks it up in verse 5. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. And they make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. So let me show you some modern day examples of phylacteries first. These are little boxes that inside have little scrolls that are written with certain key passages from the Old Testament. And the practicing Jews today will take these and bind them to their forehead and bind another one to their arm so that it's up on their bicep near their heart. So the words of God would be bound in their mind and before their eyes and in their heart.
That way, and actually, it's not just any words of Moses, or God. These are specific commandments revealed by God to Moses at Mount Sinai about how to be loyal to God, so that you can worship God with all your heart, might, mind, and strength. I actually think it's a great reminder. Like, if you take the time to put something like this on, or you see it with others, you're like, I really need to be committed to God. So as an object lesson, it actually can be a really good thing. Until the Pharisees and scribes have thought, well, all of the common people have phylacteries that have these scriptures written on them, this size. Let's make our phylacteries bigger. What is the message? If I walk into a synagogue or out at the street and it's the time of prayer and I put on my phylacteries and they're this big, and I'm standing next to a guy who's got a big box on his head and a big box sitting on his arm, the message is, wow, he has more of the Word of God in his mind and his heart. He's more righteous than me. He's better than me. I'm just a lowly simpleton with a normal-sized phylactery. That's what Jesus is condemning. Now, they also have their prayer shawls. Again, beautifully symbolic, lovely, a reminder about putting yourself in a state of reverence and humility before God.
Yeah, it's when you talk about holy envy, it's this idea of they come up with these outward ways to shut out the world. So if they put on the prayer shawl, it's this way of shutting out the world and focusing on God's word and on heaven. So it's a beautiful symbol.
And I'll use another word that we've talked about, the word enduo, which means to be clothed. And think about our temples. People are clothed in the garments of the priesthood. And these are not garments of the priesthood, but they are a form of clothing. And the point there is to represent or to symbolize your relationship with God and to say you're in a state of worshipfulness. So there's a lot of beautiful connections here with things that we're familiar with.
And so if you look at the border or the hem of the prayer shawl, you'll see these four corners, these tzitzit that come down from all four corners. And this is symbolic, the number of strands and the name tzitzit having a numeric value of 600 plus 13 knots in the corner borders adds up to 613. So when I'm praying, I'm focused on God, I'm focused on His Word, and I'm focused on His law.
Just a reminder real quickly, because we sometimes forget that the law was the set of instructions that God wanted His people to live by to show that they loved Him. Again, if you're in a loving relationship with somebody and they give you a list of like, here's my top 10 list for how you can show me love, if you really love that person, you'd be interested to know what that top 10 list is, to memorize it and to live it. And so everything we're talking about here is all rooted in a deep desire to be covenantally related to God, be covenantally combined with God.
Yeah, it's the practice, you'll notice, Jesus is not condemning the practice of using phylacteries and a prayer shawl. That he is not opposed to them saying their prayers and feeling connected to God and God's laws. What is the condemnation? Look closely back at verse 5. But of all their works they do to be seen of men, they make broad their phylacteries, and they enlarge the borders of their garment. They increase the size of these tzitzit, these tassels. They make them bigger, longer, even start adding colored strands in to draw more attention to it. So if you're standing there with a traditional sized prayer shawl next to a Pharisee who's got a much bigger and longer border to his garment, the implication is, oh, he's more righteous than me. He's more holy than me. He's better at keeping these 613 laws than me because his borders happen to be longer than mine and bigger and maybe more colorful than mine. So how hard is it to make your borders of your garments longer or more colorful, or make a phylactery that's even bigger? You don't have to be more righteous to do any of those things, and yet they're doing it to be seen of men. And that is one thing Jesus just doesn't seem to have a lot of patience for, is this hypocrisy, this self-righteous, self-aggrandizement, drawing attention to, look how good I am at keeping the law of Moses and loving God. I'm so much better than you. Jesus doesn't have a lot of patience for that. And he continues in verse 6, these Pharisees, they love the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues. They love the place of prominence. They love the glory, the honor that they can get from people. And quite frankly, we live in a world, in a fallen condition, where you have to recognize the human weakness that actually enjoys popularity, that enjoys honors of men, that enjoys the titles and honorific things that this world can place at our feet. And you have to fight against that natural tendency to worship God and love your neighbor, because those are not quite as inherently natural in the fallen state. We have to work with the Lord at developing those. Verse 7, and greetings in the markets, and to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. They love these titles. They love these seats. They love this attention. And Jesus is teaching the multitude and his disciples, stop setting your heart on those things. Don't love those. Love God and love each other.
I've had to deal a little bit with this. I spent a lot of years in graduate school, and I eventually was handed a title called doctor. And a few years went by and I realized, wait a second, who's the real doctor? It's Jesus, and he teaches doctrine. Now, I think I do a pretty good job of teaching classes and so forth and helping students, but I realized my job is not to be teaching my doctrine, it's to be teaching his doctrine, because he's the real doctor. And so it still happens today. Now look, titles inherently are not the problem. It's useful to understand who has what role and responsibility. There's a lot of confusion when people don't know who's supposed to be doing what. But I've also seen where even in the modern day, people can use titles as almost a hammer to hurt other people. Well, I have this title, you don't have it, so that says something about me, that I should get more of God's love than you. And I actually feel like titles simply should be designations of opportunities for serving people, a greater weight or responsibility to serve people. And Jesus, I think, was dealing with similar things. So I don't think titles themselves are the problem. It's how we choose to use roles and responsibilities and titles that God has given us. Is it for us, or is it to serve other people?
So Jesus goes on exactly that line in verse 8, but be not ye called rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and all ye are brethren. You're all together. You're all in this together. Look down at verse 10. Neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ, but he that is greatest among you shall be your servant. Are you seeing the subtle shift in focus here?
I should point out, I also happen to collect a master's degree. So I have a master's degree and a doctorate degree. Well, who's the real master? It's pretty clear in Scripture, Christ. So even though a worldly institution gave me that title, I hope that I don't get sucked into the honors of that title and forget who the real master is.
It's beautiful. Verse 12, whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. I love that, because it goes so against the natural tendencies of trying to build oneself up. And he's just saying, no, you just stay humble, give God the credit, and God will build you up. Don't look for men to build you up. Look to the heavens for that. And then as you turn the page over, we're going to go very quickly through verse 13 through 39, this end of this chapter, because he goes into this long speech about the scribes and the Pharisees being hypocrites. And you'll notice these are strong words. There's nothing neutral about these verses.
Now, again, if the context is we're at the temple, out in the outer courtyards, Jesus is teaching his disciples, and yet these groups that have been debating with him are still there hearing all of this. Verse 14 is interesting. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, or play actors. Ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation. This underlying word for to devour means to squander or to fully consume down till there's nothing left. And think about how often in the Old Testament, God says in the law of Moses, make sure to take care of the widow, the orphan, the fatherless. And instead, these people who've been put in positions of power are taking advantage of those who are disadvantaged. And the advantaged are making more advantage for themselves by disadvantaging the disadvantaged even more. It's very sad.
So if I could sum up verse 13 through 22 using verse 23, I think it's a conclusion to that entire column. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Did you notice his example, his little object lesson? Mint, anise, and cumin are the smallest herbs that you could grow. And they're saying, look how righteous I am. I even pay my tithing on my mint, anise, and cumin, the very smallest of the forgettable herbs in my garden. I will even pay tithing on those. Look how good I am. And he's saying, and you're leaving out judgment, mercy, and faith. You're missing the whole point.
These three words here, justice in the Old Testament, really could be translated as righteousness. Now, it's a different word here in Greek. It means to make good, righteous decisions. In the Old Testament, the word justice and righteous meant the same thing. So when he's talking about meting out justice, it means living righteously. But then you have this word mercy, very powerful. This word mercy, when it's connected to the Old Testament, is related to the compassion, the hesed that God has and that we should be having, which means covenantal loyalty and everlasting kindness to one another. And it gets back to those comments he made some verses ago where he said, love God, love your neighbor. Look, it doesn't matter how much tithing you pay on great or little things. I mean, that is an important thing, but don't let that get in the way of loving God, loving your neighbor, living righteously and acting mercifully and showing loving kindness to God and to those around you, because that's what he does. And he models for us how we should be living.
And then verse 24, he says, ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. You'll notice the contrast. He picked the very smallest animal he could come up with, a gnat. And then he contrasted it with the very biggest animal. We're on the two extremes of the animal kingdom here with these people. And he's saying, you're straining at a gnat or straining out a gnat. They would actually put these cheesecloths over their pitchers and their amphoras and their cups, and they will strain out in case if a gnat or a little flying insect got into your drink, they'll strain that out because they, by the law of Moses, they're not allowed to consume gnats or flies, mosquitoes, all of those flying insects. So we'll strain those out. And he's saying, but you're eating a camel.
Both are actually unclean things.
Both are unclean
in the law of Moses, and one takes a lot more effort.
and Joseph Smith gives this beautiful conclusion to verse 24 when he added, who make yourselves appear unto men that ye would not commit the least sin, and yet ye yourselves transgress the whole law. You're eating the whole camel, but you're showing people how righteous you're appearing to be when you strain out these gnats. And then he says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. And he basically tells them to cleanse the platter. Verse 27, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness.
So they're on the Temple Mount. What might people be able to see when they walk right off the Temple Mount? What are they going to see?
And if you look to the left, if you're walking down to the south, up on the southern part of the Mount of Olives, you've got tombs, you've got sepulchres. And keep in mind, when a person dies in the first century, and if you're not going to bury them in the ground, you're going to bury them in a tomb, you place them in the tomb, you prepare their body for burial, then you seal up the stone and you paint it white. That's your message that there's a newly buried body in the tomb. A year later, after it's gone through a whole year's cycle, you then unseal the tomb, go in, and you gather the bones together, put them in an ossuary, and put the ossuary in a niche or a loculi, and now the table is ready for the next family member to die in your family. And so a whited sepulcher looks beautiful on the outside, but on the inside, it's got a decaying body for that year. These are very strong words against the Pharisees.
This is a personal connection. Some years ago, I was at a graduate school that the outside of the buildings were absolutely gorgeous and compelling. And I went inside, went into the basement. It was just so oppressively grimy and a place that I didn't want to be. And I thought, you know, people on the outside, and you see these pictures of these buildings out on brochures, the university never is sharing pictures with potential students. Hey, come to our university and check out our basement. And I remember thinking this very thing, like, yeah, we shouldn't simply just have an outward face of making ourselves look like something. We truly should be through and through what we represent. And remember the very beginning, we talked about the image of God. We should be the living and lively image of God, not dead men's bones.
So let's conclude, jumping over to verse 37, when he says, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how oft would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. That phrase, he's going to use it again with the people in the Book of Mormon in 3 Nephi chapter 10, verse 5, that exact phrase of, I would have gathered you, but ye would not. It's not me keeping you out of the covenant. It's not me rejecting you and keeping you out of heaven. It's you. who is doing this. And he promises them in verse 38, behold, your house is left unto you desolate, which ties into Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 5. In closing, brothers and sisters, there's righteousness, and then there's self-righteousness. There are deeds that help us love God and love our fellow beings, and there are deeds that help us get the honors and the praise and the glory of the world. For me, the message from this particular set of scriptures this week is to stop looking for the praise of the world and start looking to God and to love Him with all of our heart, might, mind, and strength, and love our neighbors as ourselves, knowing that God loves them perfectly, just like He loves us perfectly. And there's something liberating about letting go of having to orchestrate everything and let God be God and let me be a humble servant doing the best I can to find as many people as I can to lift and to build and to bless and to serve, not for their praise, not to be repaid by them, but because I love them and because I love the Lord. What a beautiful pattern for us to try and try and try again to emulate from the Savior's life and His perfect example. And we leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Know that you're loved.
And spread light and goodness.